Good day, and welcome to Bizarre British History in 3D. Now, I have my tea, I've got my biscuits, I think we're ready to go take a trip. Today we're heading to the town of Eastbourne in Sussex, England. The year is 1958, and we'll be heading up the hill to the coastal fortification taken over by the mad genius Benjamin White. We're going to look at the intersection between White and another visionary genius, Stanley Long, photographer for VistaScreen, who managed to capture White's creations in stunning exterior 3D and somewhat less stunning interior work. In order to do this, however, we need to grab something, and so let's pop off for a moment to take a brief sojourn into my stereographic library. Welcome! In the cabinet behind me, you can see I have stored European glass stereo views and a few associated viewers, but there's something far more bizarre lurking in there as well. Let's have a look. Up on top here, I have 5 boxes, each containing approximately 50 packets. Now, each of the packets generally looks something like this, and they were meant to go with viewers that looked a little bit like this. The VistaScreen viewer is a plastic piece of junk with plastic lenses, and I strongly suggest that if you plan on getting into this hobby, you find yourself a ROM build betractor, even if you're not particularly interested in collecting that format. Now we're going to take some of these, and we're going to head on back to the living room. I'll see you there. Alright, I'm back, and I've got a box of VistaScreen. Now today we're going to be concentrating on 2 particular sets, each of an item within the Eastbourne Redoubt designed by Benjamin White. The first set is a commercial set called Eastbourne Model Village. And the second set, which is much more uncommon, is called the Blue Grotto Temple and Aquarium. This was only sold in the gift store at the actual structure. But by this point, I'm guessing that you're wondering what VistaScreen is. In fact, I'm convinced that you're wondering what VistaScreen is, and I might even go so far as to say that I know that you're wondering what VistaScreen is. So let's go into that for a moment, because I wouldn't want to leave you wondering. Well, I'm glad I decided that you were wondering about that, because it gives me a chance to delve into the cloudy and hazy origins of VistaScreen and Stanley Long's association with the Spring Brothers. You see, all we really know is that in late 1956, VistaScreen was incorporated and set up shop in Soho Square in London. Prior to that, we know that Stanley Long was a photographer with the Royal Air Force and had a reputation as a bit of a lad, constantly going out in the town boozing and chatting up the local birds. And it was in that capacity that he ran into Jeff and Jack Spring. Now, they owned a paper company, but were looking to start getting into publications, and so they recruited Stanley Long to shoot nudie photos for a series of coffee table books in 1956. This left Long with a conundrum. Where was he to find models? No respectable London model would pose nude for an unknown photographer. And so he hit upon a probably then novel idea. He went around to local colleges and recruited local college girls. Around the same time, Long picked up his first stereoscopic camera, a reliedoscope plate-back camera with 5 backs, not dissimilar from the camera Hoffman of Rombild Verlag Otto Schonstein had used back in the 30s and 40s. Long clearly enjoyed his work in nude photography, but he became increasingly obsessed with his new toy, the stereo camera, and so a new idea was born. Like a positron and an electron colliding, photons hit paper, and the VistaScreen was born. Thankfully, the Spring brothers had a bit of business sense about them and realized that the prevailing sentiment in Great Britain at the time was one of nostalgia, not randiness. After all, it was only 2 years after rationing had ended, only 11 years after victory in Europe was declared. Britain was looking to regain its innocence and to look back on simpler times, and there are plenty of opportunities to do so. The aristocracy was on the decline, and many historic estates had opened their doors to tourists, the only way to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, holiday parks and holiday camps were a way of taking a vacation without even leaving the country. Zoos and historic sites were fun for children and adults alike, and here at Dudley Castle, you had both. At the time, an amazingly well-stocked zoo built around the 1649 ruins of a loyalist castle destroyed during the English Civil War. Now, nostalgia wasn't the only thing that VistaScreen could uniquely provide, and that bigger companies like Viewmaster could not. Being a British company, it could concentrate on British subjects. A 3D look into the correct grip on a bat for cricketing might appeal to your typical British schoolboy. It would have little appeal outside of what remained of the British Empire. Roland Callingham's model village Basingstoke, the first of its kind, was built in the 1920s and 30s before the Second World War. After the war, however, model villages began to pop up all over Great Britain. Douglas Adams wrote, "It can hardly be a coincidence that no language on earth has ever produced the phrase as pretty as an airport. Airports are ugly. Some are very ugly. And some attain a degree of ugliness that can only be the result of a special effort." And yet, the VistaScreen set on Heathrow sold in the tens of thousands. Clearly, British subjects were a hit with, well, British subjects. Long and VistaScreen came up with one further avenue in which to make money off stereography. In addition to the commercial cards already pictured, they created souvenir sets, like this one from Portmeirion in North Wales, most famously portrayed 10 years later in the ITV show The Prisoner. These sets would be exclusive to the gift shop and would only be obtainable by visiting the location and purchasing it there. They were produced in very small numbers and are generally considered quite rare. Today, we'll be taking a look at both a commercial set and a souvenir set, most likely shot on the same day within the Eastbourne Redoubt. And now it's time to return to Benjamin White. Flash back with me, if you will, to the mid-1950s. Benjamin White had already had success building models for the model villages in Ramsgate and Hastings. He was looking for a new place to set up a model village of his own. Meanwhile, the Eastbourne City Council had just purchased the Eastbourne Redoubt for £150. Now at this point you might be wondering what a redoubt is, or what a Napoleonic coastal fortification looks like in general. And this is an interesting bit of history that I can go into in a bit of detail. You see, the Brits had not been attacked on their own soil since the 17th century, specifically. So now Eastbourne had on its hands an outmoded coastal fortification and no idea what to do with it. Here enters Benjamin White. In 1957, White struck up a deal to lease the land for a nominal fee and agree to maintain the grounds. Meanwhile, he would use it to build a model village. And he did so, and he worked on it every single day with his wife. However, Some days it would rain, or some days other weather conditions would force him to remain indoors. What was he to do? Well, of course, the redoubt had many casemates that were now empty and abandoned, and he struck upon the idea to turn this into an antiquarian Greek-style temple slash aquarium sort of tourist attraction that you could see for an additional fee. This is where Stanley Long enters the picture. Visits the redoubt after Benjamin White had begun building it, but certainly not finished, and visits the Blue Grotto Temple and Aquarium. He shoots a standard commercial set for the redoubt and a souvenir-only set for the temple and aquarium. Now let's take a look at what the two men, these two visionary geniuses, created. If you have them, put on your anaglyphic glasses now. This is sort of a picture of Fountains Abbey, the centerpiece of the Eastbourne model village. This was the first model that Benjamin White and his wife worked on after he leased the redoubt in 1957, and he maintained it until his death in 1975. It was the centerpiece of his collection, and yet here we have an image of, well, the base of it and a boat on a river. It feels like Stanley Long wasn't even trying here, as this is the worst card in the set, and the only card featuring what should have been the centerpiece of the whole set. One can only imagine that Long had shown up hungover and shot a few plates of it, or we could chalk this up to his relative inexperience at shooting model villages. This was among his first. Perhaps Long had had a cup of coffee by the time he shot the Tudor shops. What I'd like to focus on here is the exquisite detail in the model itself. Every architectural feature, person walking, and store mannequin was handcrafted by the Whites. Here, I've got to give Stanley Long some serious praise. The use of negative parallax to make the tennis court really pop out at you creates a really stunning stereoscopic effect here. It's very well executed and does justice to the model village. The coffee must have worn off by this point. This is really a terrible image. This won't be the first time you hear me lambast Stanley Long's inability to use a tripod to get his architectural angles right, but this is really egregious. As an architectural photographer myself, I give it 2 thumbs down. The model, of course, is beautiful. Neither a great stereo view nor a piece of shit like the last one, this is pretty standard Stanley Long fare. Once again, though, I draw your attention to the level of detail that went into carving out each stone, variegating the roof slate, and carving eaves for the building by hand. If it takes 10,000 hours to become a master at something, then Benjamin White was a master several times over, especially given his previous work at Ramsgate Model Village and that in Hastings. Here, Stanley Long finally, overuses negative parallax to good effect. Because the building in the foreground pokes out at you so sharply, you can really get a sense of scale when you look at the redoubt walls behind. What the dickens are you doing here, Stanley? This is just downright awful. I mean, this could have been a great image if Stanley Long hadn't focused his camera downwards at the golfers, which are entirely distracting, and chopped off the top of the spire. This would have been a great image and clearly was a great scene, and all of the elements were there. Why not pull it off right? The VistaScreen conundrum is that it's delightful when it's not utterly frustrating. And this is goddamn frustrating. I mean, who puts their camera this close to a model and expects to get a good image? You can tell exactly where Long made the error here, and yet he chose to include this among the cards in the set. Frankly, my 15-year-old niece would do better if just handed a stereo camera. This is awful. And 3 strikes and you're out, Long. Seriously, we'll just talk about the model here. This is another gorgeous work by Benjamin White. Note the attention to detail in the hunting party and their garments and all that. It was actually White's wife that did most of the fine detailed model work, especially towards the end. This is a great scene, just really poorly photographed in 3D. Thankfully, we get to end on a bright note for both the photographer and the master craftsman. This was the last card in the set. As I scan them in the order I received them, there are no official listings of which orders the cards should go in, but this is a triumph for both Long and White. For Long, it's a great overview shot that shows a true sense of scale of the models and shows that he's capable of showing restraint when it comes to going hyperstereo. For White, it shows the expanse of the work he had already completed in the first couple years of the model village's existence. Decades later, it would be even grander. And now we're going to head inside the casemates to the Blue Grotto Temple and Aquarium. From the condition of the VistaScreen Blue Grotto Temple and Aquarium packet, as well as the relative consistency in the ordering, I'm going to assume this set is presented in its original order. If that's the case, then we've just headed in to find whatever the hell this is. Now, this is no fault of Benjamin White's. He did a fine job of making plaster look like a man-made boring into igneous rock. But on Long's end, there's nothing descriptive about this except the caption, which I've displayed here, but you cannot see when looking at it through a viewer. Now here I have to ding both of our visionary geniuses. This is a first for Benjamin White during this talk, but not so much a first for Stanley Long. White should have made his stalagmites and stalactites look a little less, well, fake, and Long should have held his camera straight and used a lower contrast emulsion to make up for the high contrast lighting. Here it's hard to tell, once again, what we're even looking at, and this is again Long's fault. Even if he wound up with contrasty negatives, he could have printed through a low contrast filter to get a better result on paper. He didn't bother, and that's evident here. For White's part, it's hard to tell what the flower grotto even looks like, so we'll just assume it's a win since he mostly has wins so far. Here, White has definitely achieved a win, whereas Stanley Long has once again failed. Why not get a goddamn tripod, Stanley? I mean, seriously, look at that angle. Get a goddamn tripod, Stanley! It's exasperating how little effort the man put into his souvenir sets. However, you can tell that a lot of effort went into creating the Blue Grotto Temple. This is the sort of roadside attraction I'd drive an hour out of my way to go and spend a couple of hours at. High marks, once again, for Benjamin White. Honestly, at this point, if Stanley Long weren't already pushing up the daisies, I'd be tempted to send him a tripod myself. Sadly, this is something we're going to see again and again with VistaScreen and especially with souvenir sets. But once again, on Benjamin White's part, the Septimus Arch looks like just the kind of place I might like to hang out and take, well, some good photos. Okay, we've finally reached the aquarium in the last couple of casemates before we reach the gift shop. And I gotta say, this is a pretty good image from Stanley Long of what looks like a pretty great scene created by Benjamin White. Seeing the statuary in the middle of the aquarium would add to the antiquities vibe of the place. On to the next casemate, we have more of the same, shot from pretty much the same angle. But while Benjamin White has managed to create a different and more interesting scene inside this casemate's aquarium, Stanley Long opted for the exact same camera angle he used on the last one. I mean, seriously, dude, I know you've got other things to do, but take your time. Here's a stereo view focused on a crab, except for the fact that it's not. That is to say, the stereography is not focused on the crab at all. Long could have waited a few minutes and seen if the crab went anywhere and did anything interesting and maybe differentiated itself from the rocks around it, but, you know, he had boozing to do and birds to chat up, as previously discussed. It's hard to judge White's contribution to this, since it's really a close-up of something you can barely see. In the sunken galleon, Benjamin White has clearly created something that I would love to see, but Stanley Long has failed to capture it adequately, owing to the fact that he didn't bother to put polarizing filters on his two taking lenses. Get a tripod and some polarizing filters, Long. Now clearly, I regard Benjamin White as a visionary genius, the sort of outsider weirdo who does things because he wants to, and has a joyful life because of it. What of Stanley Long, though? It sounds like I might hate him, right? Well, no. The shoddiness of his photography is one of the quaint charms that I've come to associate with VistaScreen, and you can look forward to much more of it on future episodes of Bizarre British History in 3D.